کنفرانس در کنگره آمریکا. تضمین عدالت و حفاظت برای ساکنان اشرف. واشنگتن 3 فوریه 2012 14 بهمن 1390.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And I want to start out by saying I've come to many of these things. But I look at where we are. I want to see you all in Tehran someday. Senator Amato talked about the fact that what our country has done here is a disgrace. And I echo those sentiments. When I first got involved with this issue back in July and started learning about Ashraf and learning about the fact that the United States government, a general of the United States forces, contracted with each and every one of the residents of Ashraf. If they relinquished their weapons, we promised that we would protect them. Have we lived up to our promise? Absolutely not. Maybe until 2009, we did a pretty good job. But all of a sudden in 2009, when we turned it over to the Iraqis, all responsibility for military action and for police action was turned over to the Iraqis. We essentially washed our hands on that promise. And yes, Senator D'Amato is right. In 2009 and in 2011, not only did this attack occur with the use of vehicles and weapons that have been given to the Iraqi police by the United States of America, but United States forces in both instances were withdrawn from the immediate area so they couldn't do anything to stop the carnage. Is that living up to our promise? Of course not. It's diametrically opposed to the promise we made, and that general was speaking for the United States of America and for all 300 million of our citizens. Subsequent to that, have we stood by the residents of Ashraf? Did we take a stand and say, wait, why can't we do this right here in Ashraf? Why does there have to be a closure of the camp? To what purpose? Iraqi government, tell me a purpose, a legitimate purpose to Iraqi security or anything else that's going to be served by closing down Ashraf. There was no need to close Ashraf in the beginning. And the United States government should have stood by the residents and stood by our promise and said no. And then how are we going to ensure protection of the residents? Well, it's my belief that we should have done one of two things. One, we should have left a small number of United States Marines by to protect the residents of Ashraf until they were all out of the country. You know, so we could have easily done that and lived up to our responsibilities. One of my proudest moments as a supporter of the president was when the president said, we are not going to let the residents of Benghazi be subject to genocide. And U.S. military power and NATO power is going to stop that from happening. And we did, and we toppled one of the world's worst dictators. Well, we never contracted with the people in Benghazi. We never promised them anything. But we as America, the defender of democracy and freedom in this planet, we believed it was our right to do so. And we did. Well, we signed a contract with these residents. They're in a much better position to expect our help and our protection than the residents of Benghazi were. And we've turned our back on them. So yes, as our moderator said, it's time for the U.S. to stand up. It's time for us to fulfill our responsibility. It's time to not only fulfill our obligation to the residents of Ashraf, but many of you who've been coming here have heard me say this before. It's time to fulfill our obligation to the 4,000 plus United States soldiers who died in Iraq. You've heard me say, as governor of Pennsylvania, I was the commander-in-chief of the Pennsylvania National Guard, and no National Guard in the country lost more men and women in Iraq than Pennsylvania did. And I used to comfort the families, or at least try to comfort the families, by telling them that their sons or in one case their daughter, had died creating democracy and freedom and making Iraq a better place. And I don't know what I would say to them now, knowing what I know about what's happened here. So it's time for us to act. What should that action be? Well, first and foremost, we should not let Camp Liberty be turned into a prison. We should not. That's job one for the United States, job one for the UN. And I was happy to see the UNHCR say that freedom of movement was essential. Because everyone says, well, this is a refugee camp. It's meeting the standards of a refugee camp. But what's the difference between the normal refugee camp and what's proposed at Camp Liberty? Here, the Iraqis have made it clear that there will not be, as long as their position holds, freedom of movement, that the people are going to be inside this small area forever. We should insist, as the UNHCR said, the U.S. should insist that there be freedom of movement. We should insist that the MOU be enforced. There's not one resident of Ashraf over there yet, and the MOU is being torn asunder. The MOU clearly says that the residents can take personal property and vehicles. The Iraqis now say that that's not the case. It is time for us, the United States, to join the UN and to be heard loud and clear, whatever the leverage is. And I agree with Ambassador Ginsburg. We've got that leverage, and we should enforce it. It's time to be heard. It's time to say, no one's going. No one's leaving until you live up to the MOU. The Iraqi government, you live up to the MOU and you allow freedom of movement. Next, it is time to delist. If you've been coming to these regularly, you've heard me say in the last 2 months that I think we can put delisting on the back burner. The most important thing is the safety of the residents. But I don't believe that anymore. And let me tell you why. You all know what the Fars news agency is much better than me, in which it quotes the Iranian ambassador to Iraq, a man, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Danafar. And let me read you just a couple of quotes from this release. The ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Iraq stressed that the UN and its representatives in Iraq, in meetings they have had, have repeatedly stressed that the UN considers the MEK a terrorist group and will not support it under any circumstances. Then he goes on. It says, Danafar referred to U.S. official support for the terrorist group. That's all of us up here. He referred to us and said, the terrorist MEK group in the past few years has been constantly supported by the U.S. and Western elements. But it is interesting now that the U.S. government has announced it is not prepared to accept even one member of this terrorist organization and under no circumstances would allow them onto its soil. It goes further. Acceptance of the members of the terrorist group by the government of Iran will not include leaders, and the amnesty will include individuals whose hands are not tainted in blood. Meaning that this idea that we can relocate all the residents of Ashraf to Liberty and there'll be no arrests, he's given fair warning here. Now, what was our response? We brought all of this up with Ambassador Fried. His response was, oh, the Iranians, they exaggerate all the time. They don't really tell the truth. You can't believe anything they say. They just say things for effect. That's not engagement. That's not us living up to our responsibility. It is time to delist just because of these statements. Just because of the statements. But we think it is time to act. It is time to stand up. And when they reviewed the evidence in 2008, when Secretary Rice refused to delist, they found there wasn't any evidence. And if they review the evidence in 2012, guess what they're going to find? That there isn't any evidence. So it is time to stand up and say, this is not a terrorist organization. There's no evidence to the contrary. So let's delist. And let's get all of the congressmen who came in here. And they've been good allies, and they've spoken up, and they've passed resolutions. And those are all good things. And those have all increased the pressure. But it is time. I know if Senator Amato was still in the Congress, there would be a bill along the lines of what Ambassador Ginsburg said. The only way to hit them is to hit them where it counts.